Out there in the distance, you see the southern Alberta prairies on a sunny day in the fall. We're on a road trip. We're on a road trip of discovery and maybe to solve a mystery. We want to know what the heck happened to Arthur Cato. So we're on a road trip of discovery. We're going to go to Moose Jaw and look at the records, and we're taking this Nissan Pathfinder on our road trip.
The first Canadian rifles from Saskatchewan sailed for the trenches of World War I France in the early summer of 1915. Arthur Bertram Cato, my grandfather, was with them. Arthur Cato had enlisted in late 1914, part of a huge Canadian war effort that was spurred by appeals to patriotism and promises of a quick victory. It was all a lie, but convincing. Some 620,000 Canadians enlisted with the Canadian Expeditionary Force during the war, and approximately 424,000 served overseas. An outsized contribution for a Canada with just 8 million people at the time.
So this is Moose Jaw, the friendly city.
I can't say if Arthur Cato was himself a patriotic fighting man, or if he went to France simply to escape his life in Moose Jaw. My instincts tell me it was a little bit of both. We know that at 37 he was very old to enlist as a private, old enough to be the father of some of his fellow privates. We also know the war changed his life forever, and that he never returned home to Moose Jaw. Arthur Cato was not only very old for a private, he was also a family man with 4 daughters, and he lived in then Saskatchewan's largest city, and a growing commercial hub that would years later be highly valued by the bootlegging gangster Al Capone. In Moose Jaw, Arthur Cato lived on Athabasca Street.
So this is 935 Athabasca Street in Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. And this is where Arthur Cato, his wife, and 3 daughters, eventually a 4th, came to live.
Up until the Great War, Arthur Cato's life had not been particularly novel or even interesting. Yet that changed because of the war and because of what happened after the war. And what of Ethel Cato? She lived until 1952, long after he married his second wife, Annie Alice Harrison of England. Arthur Cato returned from the gruesome fight. He was discharged in Halifax in 1920 and then went to Montreal, where he promptly created an entirely new life for himself. Indeed, after marrying for a second time, Arthur Cato moved to Toronto. Annie Harrison was 25 years old when in November of 1920, she wed a man nearly twice her age, 43-year-old Arthur. Within 3 years, they had 2 sons. The youngest was my father, Bruce, the oldest by 2 years, Norman. We are certain that neither of them knew about their half-sisters in Moose Jaw. And we know that eventually Arthur Cato returned to the country of his birth, England, where he died in 1948 working as the steward in a modest gentleman's club in Bridgewater. There seems little doubt that Arthur Cato was a casualty of the Great War, perhaps among the many thousands of Canadian soldiers who suffered shell shock and what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. I like to think that my grandmother helped nurse him in London, perhaps working as a volunteer or a nurse in the hospital. It's romantic to think they fell in love and decided to start a life together in Canada, far away from the horrors of World War I. But because there are no records of a divorce, it seems that Arthur Cato started his second life with his second wife as a bigamist. To this day, I have been dogged by the question, why would a relatively old man, Arthur Cato, trade his prairie family for the pure hell that was the trenches? If a bullet or a piece of shrapnel didn't kill you or maim you, you might die of gassing, dysentery, the Spanish flu, or typhoid. The Great War is proof human beings are capable of the worst atrocities. In this conflict, some 16 million died and 37 million were casualties. Seen through the lens of his wartime experiences, perhaps we can at least partially understand why Arthur Cato abandoned his Moose Jaw family, choosing to erase all memory of everything that happened before the war. We do know that during the war, he stayed loyal to Ethel. His pay and bonuses were sent to her while he was fighting and suffering. His last payment to Ethel amounted to half his discharge pay. The rest he used to start a second family with a new love.
And so we returned to Calgary after a road trip. As for Arthur Cato, well, we know he went to Moose Jaw in the 1908, 1909, that time, and he went off to war to fight in France in 1915, and he never came back. He remarried in Montreal, leaving a family back in Moose Jaw, set up a household just outside of Toronto, and eventually that family emigrated back to the United Kingdom.